Hello, my name is Amy Kimball, and I am the Materials Manager for Special Collections. The overarching function of my role is to make sure researchers needing books from special collections get what they need. In the reading room, for class sessions, for imaging, or for exhibits and other outreach. Throughout the week, I divide my time between 3 of our locations, with Evergreen being my regular Friday spot. I speak to you today as a steward of the books that make up special collections, including the collection at Evergreen. Maybe some of you are bird watchers or gardeners or like to study butterflies or collect seashells on the beach. I'm a horrible gardener, but I do enjoy watching the birds in my backyard, seeing and hearing geese in their V's honking like a rusty bicycle wheel overhead, and watching the murmurations of starlings that drift through my neighborhood at the change of the seasons. And we are in the midst of one of those changes right now. Birds are active and chattery and building nests. Flowers have been coming up and the trees are greening out. We are well into the season of bees and butterflies and blossoms. But there's something I have to acknowledge here as well. Months ago, when I was invited to do a presentation on the natural history books in the collection, I had no idea that we would be standing at such a crucial moment in history, that instead of celebrating the anniversaries of some of our national parks, we would be facing once again the urgency of conservation and responsible stewardship. I also have to acknowledge that the books we will discuss today were born out of privilege. Privilege of the makers, of their patrons who financed the work, of the collectors who acquired the books, and of myself as well, for I am in a privileged position to be able to handle these items in this setting on a regular basis. Finally, I must pause to recognize the fact that within the materials we will see today, there is no representation of books created by Indigenous people, by women, by people of color. Indeed, we are going to encounter men who relied on the labor of these populations as slaves, servants, trackers and guides, artists, colorists, etc., to support their work. I will also be showing at least one image that depicts Indigenous people as they were regarded at the time. Please feel free to disengage momentarily from the talk if these images are upsetting to you. If you have been to Evergreen, you are familiar with the setting as it is now, and can imagine the surroundings in which John Work Garrett grew up. Though the Garretts were ensconced in mercantile and industrial endeavors, there was a deep appreciation of nature that ran through the family as well. If you have not yet had a chance to visit the exhibition Leave No Trace, John Work Garrett in the American Outdoors, please make sure to do so. It is up through June 8th in the North Wing at Evergreen, and well worth a visit. Some of you may have seen Michelle Fitzgerald's excellent presentation on A Lunch with the Libraries last summer. I won't repeat what Michelle has already so eloquently stated, but we know that John and his brothers and father went out to shoot birds, tried their hand at taxidermy, and created displays of the specimens they had shot. We know how formative their trips out to the West were for them as young men. I titled this talk More Than Words, More Than Birds, because we are going to look at a lot of images, and I wanted to try to show a wide range of things. But you'll note that we will go heavy on birds. Ornithology was, after all, the Garrett's natural history focus, both outdoors in nature and indoors in the library. The reading room at Evergreen is full of books about travel to places around the globe and the history of those places. Under the Covarrubias lunettes depicting John Work Garrett's diplomatic postings, one can read a raft of Baedeker guides or John Work Garrett's copy of The Wonders of Alaska, which he purchased in Alaska aboard the SS Queen in 1892, or his mother Alice Whitridge Garrett's copy of John Muir's The Mountains of California. I mention these as an indicator that the family's library reflected more than simply an interest in building a premier collection of rare and beautiful volumes, though that was definitely the heart of it. John's father, T. Harrison Garrett, had built his collections around his interests of coins, rugs, prints, and books. In book collecting, he was especially interested in travel and exploration, Americana, printing history, and what we might call plate books, large format volumes with impressively printed illustrations, sometimes containing little or no explanatory text at all. Natural history as a subject stands as a junction of all of these things. distilling the exploration of the world in general into the specific focus of one main topic, and depicting these subjects often in glorious full-color, sometimes life-size images. Natural history books were a way of showing off the wonders of the world and sharing that knowledge in a vibrant and luxurious way. Many of the books we will see today bear T. Harrison Garrett's bookplate. So what is natural history? The phrase was first used in relation to Pliny the Elder's History of the World, Historia Naturalis, and refers to natural phenomenon of a region, including plants, animals, and other objects, as observed or described systematically. It is the companion to the scientific study through experimentation within the ologies, biology, ornithology, dendrology, oology, geology, and their companion botany. So a systematic account based on observation rather than experimentation. The people we will discuss today were not operating in a vacuum. They knew of their predecessors and their near contemporaries. There was a collaboration and sometimes a rivalry among those that were contemporaries, and there was an element of competition to outdo or improve upon or outright copy what had come before. In 1939, John gave a talk to the Political Literary or PL Club, a group of men who gathered at Evergreen to discuss and present topics of interest within their own expertise. John's presentations leaned towards topics of a diplomatic nature, but he also spoke on a couple of occasions about the contents of his library. A talk in April 1939 was titled Natural History in America Before Audubon, and reflected not only John's engagement with book collecting, but also with his expertise as an amateur ornithologist himself. In keeping with the idea that natural history in the Americas was born out of travel and exploration, Garrett points to Thomas Harriot's A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia from 1588 as the earliest natural history in the American colonies. Harriot was a mathematician and navigational expert associated with Sir Walter Raleigh's voyages to Virginia, and A Brief and True Report was a product of his time spent in the Roanoke colony from 1585 to 1586. His studies were not limited to flora and fauna, but focused greatly on the indigenous people, likely the Algonquin, who he encountered. His text was paired with the engravings made by Theodore de Bry and based on the watercolors of John White. So early on, we see an example of the melding of a text from one source, original images from another source, and printed or interpretation through yet another hand. In the case of the Garrett copy of the French edition of 1590, the etchings were then hand-colored by yet another set of hands. In the image, which is entitled Their Manner of Fishing in Virginia, many of the creatures depicted are easily recognizable. Rays, horseshoe crabs, a land crab, catfish, hammerhead sharks, a brown pelican, and other fish and some eely things. It has been suggested that the plant life on the foreshore is not identifiable, but I think that some of them are at least recognizable enough to evoke possibilities. Maybe a wild geranium or a cardinal flower. We can recognize the same fauna and flora in Mark Catesby's The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands. Like Harriot and White, Mark Catesby came to Virginia in pursuit of science. Born in England to a family of some means, Catesby became acquainted with natural history at a young age through his grandfather and his grandfather's neighbors who were botanists. He was familiar with White's work as well as with that of other British naturalists. His expeditions through Virginia, the Carolinas, and the Bahamas were financed through sponsors at the Royal Academy, with his charge being to send back as many specimens, mostly seeds, but also birds, reptiles, and sea creatures preserved in rum, as he could. In part, he was interested in identifying which plants might be able to be cultivated in England. His two expeditions, between 1712 and 1719, and then 1722 to 1726, were financed in this way, but production of a book from his images was not. Catesby would later secure monetary backing for the publication of the book. However, initially, he prepared himself to produce as much as possible by his own hand. Though not a trained artist, which he himself comments on in the introduction to the 1754 edition, he not only did the watercolors himself and penned the text, but he also learned how to do copperplate engraving so he could engrave the plates himself. For the first edition, he was also involved in the hand coloring of the plates for at least volume 1. Let's take a moment now to look at a couple of the images. Here is a loggerhead turtle, as we saw in the debris and white. Here is a lovely catfish, also as we've seen in the debris and white. So Catesby and his predecessors were seeing the same flora and fauna. The natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands can be considered to be the first fully illustrated survey of British colonies in North America. Catesby was first to use the folio format in order to depict many of the subjects at life size or portions of the subject at life size, as we'll see later with the flamingo. The book was issued in 11 parts of 20 plates each over a period of several years. We are in the Fish and Reptiles volume right now. There were 155 subscribers to the first edition. Subscribers could opt to purchase the 200 plates, hand-colored, or for half the price, leave them as black and white, though there seems to be no indication that any black and white copies exist. The Garrett copy is the third edition of 1771, with reset text and published by Benjamin White. The Linnaean names have been added to some of the figures where possible. The plates include 109 birds, 33 amphibians and reptiles, 46 fishes, 31 insects, and 9 quadrupeds, as well as 171 plants. Catesby did draw from life, especially important in order to accurately capture color, but he worked heavily from the specimens he had shipped back to England. Some species were described for the first time by Catesby, there being no other precedent in the same fashion, and he attempted in many cases to pair fauna with the flora of their diet or environment. He also dissected some of the birds in order to study the contents of their stomachs to place them in the correct ecological context. Catesby didn't always get his facts right, but he was one of the earliest European naturalists to recognize that birds migrate, and published a paper on the topic in the Journal of the Royal Society in 1747. Now might be a good time to discuss some of the steps that go into making a natural history plate book. This is something of a generalization, but will provide a framework to help put these volumes into context. An original drawing was done by the artist. This is an Audubon watercolor of Bell's Vireo. This did not actually appear in the double elephant folio, but the final version is seen here in the Royal Octavo. An uncolored print was made. Original watercolor, or an example print that had been colored, called a pattern plate, was provided to the colorists. These pattern plates were done by James Sowerby, the first in a family of natural history draftsmen. He trained first through the Royal Academy, subsequently supporting himself by teaching drawing and by miniature and portrait painting, but found that he did not enjoy trying to always please his subject. Turning to landscape painting, he persuaded William Curtis to hire him to illustrate some of his publications. Through Curtis, he not only mastered the skills of botanical illustration, but observed enough of etching and engraving to become proficient in those media. Working with Curtis and then Sir James Edward Smith, an English doctor, botanist, and founder of the Linnaean Society, and himself a prolific author, Sowerby became one of the most well-established botanical artists in England. He was also a collector and amassed what he intended to be his own museum, a complete collection of British natural history. Geology was, as they say, trending, and Sowerby turned his attention to publishing books on the topic. The Mineral Conchology of Great Britain, a record of fossils, was published by subscription in 113 parts between the years 1812 and 1846, though Sowerby himself only published up through volume 3, with his sons taking over after his death. Here you can see the pattern plate of one of the images and the final printed version. And I will show you another one that has some notes on it to the colorist. This one says that black spots are too dark. Doesn't appear that that's changed too much in the final image. And here are Sowerby's notes along the side to the colorist about how dark this shell needs to be. You can see that it's much darker in the final hand-colored version. Many of the specimens described in the Mineral Conchology were later acquired by the British Museum. The engraver copied the drawing onto a printing plate etching, engraving, chromolithography, etc. This is an Audubon printing plate. It is thought that only about 85 of the original 435 plates survive. This is the Harlequin duck. And this is the Harlequin duck after it has been printed and hand-colored. Getting back to the printing process. Notes on the watercolor directed the colorist how to proceed, and often even the palette of watercolors had already been selected for them. We are looking here at the work of John Abbott. Abbott was interested in entomology and drawing from the time of his youth. His family received a copy of Catesby's work as a gift, and it is thought that the example of Catesby had some influence on Abbott's move to Virginia. Though he studied engraving formally, he found himself working in his father's solicitor's office in 1769. Natural history proved too strong a pull and law not enough of an anchor, and by 1773 he had departed England for Virginia under the patronage of the Royal Society and was actively collecting specimens when the upheaval of the American Revolution caused him to relocate again to the Savannah River Valley in Georgia. He spent the rest of his life there collecting and illustrating flora and fauna, selling both paintings and specimens to support his family. Abbott's activities weren't limited to insects. He was also prolific in his documentation of regional birds as well. In 1797, his images were published by Sir James Edward Smith, yes, the same. The result was the Natural History of the Rare Lepidopterous Insects of Georgia, the earliest book published on American butterflies and moths. Smith dedicated the book to Miss Marie Ann Johns. The Garrett copy is unusual in that the illustrations are the original watercolors bound together with letterpress, likely by the publisher James Edwards. A manuscript letter from Edwards to Miss Johns has been tipped into the front of Volume 1, a letter written to her when he presented her with the two volumes. John Sr. and Edwards were friends. Volume 1 is also dedicated in print to Miss Johns. Abbott provided the images and information about the cycle of each species, and Smith edited Abbott's text and provided additional information in the book. The text was provided in both English and French in order to appeal to a wider range of potential buyers. It contains the images of 24 butterflies and 80 moths native to Georgia and Virginia. Smith's notes can be seen on some of the drawings, in some cases instructing the engraver to alter figures for the published plates. On the original drawing of Plate 8, Smith inscribed, "Mr. Abbott writes the flower ought to be a brighter purple." Colorists could work singly or as a group. The printer may have had their own studio of colorists or hired in. Women and children were often hired for this work as they were paid a lower wage. For the Audubon Double Elephant Folio, though, Havell had a studio of at least 50 colorists. Others, like Sowerby, may have called upon his family members to serve as colorists. All of the decisions about the grade and size of paper, the amount of detail on the print, whether any background to the image on the print was to be colored or not, were made before the colorists started working. Mistakes had to be washed off if possible, or the spoiled print was abandoned. Of course, there would be inconsistencies in the quality and accuracy of painting, as with the differing levels of ability of the colorists. Once the colorist's work was completed, the colored prints were then assembled with the text and either bound within paper wrappers before sending that part to the subscriber or bound into a complete volume. We can glimpse into the world of botanical illustration through a small, scarce volume written by Antoine Pascal, a student of Pierre-Joseph Rodoté. Originally written in French and subsequently translated into German, Pascal's Rodoté's Art of Flower Painting, or Instructions for Painting Flowers in Watercolor, of 1839 demonstrates not only the method used by Rodoté, but also gives a general introduction for different forms of painting and an introduction to botany. Another section focuses on the materials, drawing, painting, and the framing of pictures. At the back of Pascal's volume, there are 8 plates, 2 general plates, and with numerous figures providing examples for the artist and illustrating the use of color and perspective. The other 6 plates depict 3 different flowers, each colored and uncolored. Pierre-Joseph Rodoté had been appointed flower painter to both Marie Antoinette prior to the French Revolution and to Empress Josephine after. He was closely associated with the Jardin des Plantes, at the time the Jardin du Roi, becoming professor of iconography after his royal patrons were no longer living. His reputation as a botanical illustrator and watercolorist eventually resulted in his publishing 2 titles in which his name as the artist took precedent over that of the writer of the text. We are looking here at what might be his most well-known and famous title, Les Roses, issued in 30 installments between 1817 and 1825. Les Roses featured more than 150 different kinds of roses, some of which were types that hadn't been described before. The descriptions were written by amateur botanist Claude Antoine Tory. For the printing of his drawings from watercolor, Redoute adopted a method of color engraving called stipple engraving, which differed from the process we have seen in that the plate began its life as an entity in color. A dense grid of tiny dots was hammered into the copper plate and color applied in such a way that the plate could be printed in multiple colors at the same time. It was a time-consuming, exacting, and expensive process. Once printed, the images were finished off in watercolor by hand. The stippling is visible in both states of the image, here in the Pascal and here in the Redoute, and you'll note the difference in texture between a completed image with a stipple engraving and with one without in Catesby. But to return to the states and to turn to birds. Alexander Wilson was a former weaver, a teacher, and poet who emigrated to America from Scotland. He lived in Philadelphia, home also to William Bartram and Charles Wilson Peale, both established ornithologists with large collections of specimens to which Wilson had access. His American Ornithology, or the Natural History of the Birds of the United States, published in 1808, was the first American bird book with colored plates published in America, comprising of 262 species in 320 figures. Wilson was familiar with the works of White, Buffon, Catesby, and others, and found them lacking in scope and intended a more complete documentation. His 9-volume work, the last was completed posthumously, was instantly successful and was well known to John James Audubon, his sometime rival and seeming successor. It has been suggested that Audubon borrowed some of the poses for his birds from Wilson, though such borrowing was not uncommon in natural history illustration. Though Wilson's paintings varied in quality, his descriptions were thorough and tended to be poetic. Wilson had learned drawing from Bartram, who shared his library, his garden, and his knowledge about birds with Wilson. Alexander Lawson, the engraver of the plates in American Ornithology, had tutored him in the process of etching and was well able to interpret Wilson's drawing onto metal. Lawson was also known to have improved some of Wilson's compositions and to have filled in background details lacking in the paintings themselves. You'll note right away a difference in the composition from what we've seen in Catesby and from what we'll see in Gould and Audubon, in that Wilson depicted multiple birds, multiple species, in a single image. This was a cost-saving measure as well as a space-saving one. Wilson's focus was as much on the description of the organism and its habits and environment as he was about capturing visual representation. Text and images both appear in each of the volumes, with text taking something of a primacy and the images interspersed at intervals. Wilson placed some of his birds in the context of their surroundings and habitats, though with minimalist depiction of nests, eggs, diet, and flora. A few, notably the waterfowl, are shown with a more elaborate landscape in the background. Some birds are shown both male and female, like these cardinals. Others have been rendered in various poses to suggest motion and to capture the range of their plumage. It was not Wilson's aim, however, to depict birds at life size nor even to scale. The darkening that we see on the pages is offsetting from the paint used in the hand coloring process, but also does sometimes occur from the letterpress itself. We come now to John James Audubon and the double elephant folio in the room. There is so much I could say about Audubon. Reams have already been written about him, dissecting his life, letters, journals, art, and self-promotion from just about every angle. Like his masterpiece, he looms large. So, what's so special about Audubon? Audubon was interested in going further than either Catesby or Wilson had managed to do, while at the same time delivering a luxury product as an end result of his artistic endeavors. And indeed, The Birds of America was the most expensive ornithological work in the world. You see, in many ways, it isn't that Audubon simply did something completely new and revolutionary in his work. It was how he pulled together the practices and methods that have been used by his predecessors and supersized them that made the 4-volume double elephant folio set of Birds of America so spectacular. As we have seen, he was not the first to print in a folio size or to depict birds at life size, but he was the first to do it consistently with every bird in every setting, no matter how awkward the pose needed to be in order to fit an entire flamingo or swan or heron into the largest paper size available for printing. He was not the first to sell portions of the work by subscription in order to pay for its printing, nor the first to depict birds in their native environment, complete with diet, prey, and habitat. He wasn't the first to show birds from different perspectives and not just in profile, nor to show male, female, and often juveniles, nor to show a variety of species on one page. He was, however, an innovator when it came to depicting multiple birds of the same species in one image. But some numbers. The Birds of America was published in 1827 to 1838 in London. There are 435 hand-colored etchings, which also used aquatint over-etching in some of them. The first 10 plates were done by Lazar, but the remaining were done by Robert Havell. The 4 volumes were published in 87 parts of 5 plates each, 1 large, 1 medium, and 3 small. There were 161 original subscribers. Thought to be about 120 bound sets remaining of the original print run of about 200. Each volume measures 40.5 inches by 28 inches and weighs about 60 pounds. I mentioned earlier that these men and their works were known to each other. Audubon first met Alexander Wilson in Kentucky in 1810 when Wilson was seeking subscribers for his American Ornithology. Wilson also met John Abbott on that same journey. Already well practiced in posing, drawing, and painting birds, it is possible that Audubon's idea for Birds of America was inspired by this brief meeting, and Wilson is one of the few people to whom Audubon acknowledged any kind of debt in terms of influence. They would meet again a year before Wilson's death, but their styles and approach were completely different. Wilson's ornithology had whetted the appetite of an audience and press who wanted someone to take up the work and continue with more description of more native species. Audubon was positioned to do so and to surpass Wilson in scope and scale. Those friends of Wilson who saw themselves as keepers of his legacy were not too pleased with Audubon's audacity at creating a work to rival that which they had so diligently worked to complete after Wilson's early death. The reception Audubon received when in Philadelphia seeking backing for his project was not warm, and Wilson's engraver, Alexander Lawson, refused to work with him. As a result, Audubon traveled to Europe to meet with publishers in several places, ultimately finding the team he needed in Britain, including the necessary number of subscribers to get the project off the ground. Like Redoute, he could count aristocratic and royal patronage as part of his financial backing, and even George IV became a subscriber. And in France, Redoute himself used his influence to persuade the Duchess of Orleans to subscribe. Ultimately, wealthy and institutional subscribers would be found in the United States as well, and it is thought that John Work Garrett's copy once belonged to one of the early subscribers. But there was always a balance between income and expenses, and Audubon spent a good deal of his energy on arranging finances as well as arranging birds. The double elephant folio Birds of America did not make Audubon's fortune, nor even ensure his financial security. However, the Royal Octavo edition of the book was a bestseller. Also sold by subscription, the initial print run of 300 copies was expanded to over 1,000. The Garrett copy of the Royal Octavo is a first edition featuring prints that were lithographed and hand-colored by the studio of J.T. Bowen in Philadelphia from 1839 to 1844. It also included some of the text of the Ornithological Biography, a companion volume to the Double Elephant Folio that was a collaboration of Audubon and William McGillivray, who remains unnamed as the author on the publication. Audubon was not good about sharing credit. It is impossible to fit all that is Audubon into one presentation, so I'd like to shift now to a near contemporary of his, and sometimes referred to as the British Audubon, John Gould. The two men were friends and correspondents, by the way. A taxidermist of birds and a giraffe, Gould became an animal preserver at the Museum for the Zoological Society of London and was later promoted to superintendent of its ornithological department. He is sometimes known through his work classifying finches for Charles Darwin and was a Fellow of the Royal Society from 1843. Gould's interest in travels were far-reaching, and John Work Garrett owned a complete set of Gould's works, or almost 4,000 plates in 40 folio volumes, which includes a monograph of trogons, the birds of Australia, a monograph of the pittas, the mammals of Australia, a monograph of the kangaroos, a monograph of the toucans, the birds of Great Britain, the birds of Asia, the birds of New Guinea and the adjacent islands, a century of birds from the Himalaya mountains, the birds of Europe, and iconas avium, or figures and descriptions of new and interesting species of birds from various parts of the globe. And last but not least, a monograph of the family of hummingbirds in 6 volumes. It was the hummingbirds of the Americas that fascinated Gould, and he became an authority on them. He had a vast collection of birds, around 1,500 specimens representing 320 species of hummingbird, and worked almost exclusively from skins. The hummingbirds captured the public's attention when Gould was permitted to display them in a special building he had been allowed to build in the Zoological Gardens at the time of the 1851 Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace. Over 80,000 people, including Queen Victoria, visited the display, though unfortunately this popularity fueled a craze for iridescent feathers for women's hats and fashions and led to an increase in the slaughter of birds for the market. Gould himself had not seen a single live specimen until his visit to the U.S. in 1857, explicitly for that purpose. It happened to be in Philadelphia in the garden that had been William Bartram's. In his earlier works, his wife Elizabeth had been his first artist, making drawings from his rough sketches and transferring them to a lithograph stone. Unfortunately, she had died by the time he was working on the hummingbird volumes. Here's one of his sketches, though. But Gould had employed H.C. Richter and William Hart to render his drawings into print. These books, like Gould's earlier publications, had hand-colored lithographic plates, but the biggest discussion when it came to hummingbirds was how to capture the iridescence of their plumage. This was done by using gold or silver leaf, transparent oils, and washes of color to capture the shine and movement of those feathers. This was a technique that he had learned from William Bailey of Philadelphia, a hummingbird specialist who had outlined the method in exacting detail in their correspondence. Though Bailey had used the technique in illustration for his own monograph, his book was never published. Finally, to return to the idea of stewardship. For the most part, these men, tramping around in the wilds, shooting specimens, or sitting in their parlors stuffing and posing a plethora of dead skins, were not conservationists. Their observations of and interactions with nature, however, put them in the position of becoming at least somewhat ecologically aware. Catesby was deliberate in not taking too many samples from one area. He, as well as Audubon, ate at least some of his kills. Hunger, curiosity, research. Those whose paths took them into the land noticed the change in animal and bird populations. The difficulty in locating some species that had previously been described elsewhere. We know that these books document several species that have since become extinct. The Carolina parakeet, passenger pigeon, Labrador duck, pinnated grouse, great auk, the Tasmanian tiger, just to name a few. And certainly many more currently face endangered status or extinction. In a journal entry from December 1826, Audubon lamented the ecological changes that were taking place before him as a result of habitat destruction and overpoaching. Quote, "A century hence, they will not be there as I see them. Nature will have been robbed of many brilliant charms. The rivers will be tormented and turned from their primitive course. The deer may exist nowhere. Fish will no longer abound in the rivers, the eagle scarcely ever alight, and the millions of lovely songsters be driven away or slain by man. Likewise, Alexander Wilson, in the text of American Ornithology, noted that the pinnated grouse was becoming less frequent and more difficult to find. Their scarcity, he wrote, may be viewed as foreboding their eventual extermination. An unfortunate precognition, as the pinnated grouse was declared extinct in 1932. I hope you have enjoyed seeing the beauty of these natural history books. They give us much to think about in terms of the world around us and how it has changed since these men documented it. As of this date, there are over 12,000 species of plant or animal in the United States listed as endangered. In John Work Garrett's lifetime, 26 national parks were established in the United States with the goal to preserve land, habitat, and species. These include Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Shenandoah, the Great Smoky Mountains, and the Everglades, among others. In the West, these were areas across which the Garretts had traveled and studied. In the East, they were areas where Catesby, Abbott, Bartram, Wilson, and Audubon had explored. Through their works, we are able to glimpse at the natural world as it was depicted so beautifully and documented so carefully. Because of the collecting of T. Harrison and John Work Garrett, we've been able to share these books today. But today, please take a minute to look out your window or to get out for a walk. Pay attention to what's around you. This is such a fantastic time of year to do so. Just sit and look for a while. The books we've seen today were born first out of careful observation and to a great degree by the affinity that their makers had for being outdoors, an affinity shared also by the Garretts and hopefully by some of you.
Hello and welcome to the live portion of our broadcast, the question and answers. I see we have some good questions, some challenging questions coming in already, and I hope that I can do my best to answer those for you. So keep posting them, and I'll do what I can. All right, so the questions we've gotten already, and let me remind you, I'm not an expert, but I'll do my best. I do work in a library, so if I don't know the information, I know where to find it, or I can find it. So the first question is, it may be a big question, but are there resources or courses one can take for learning how to preserve or digitize natural history, art, or literature? I'm sure there are. I do not know what those are off the top of my head. I know there are a lot of websites that have digitized images. If you have things of your own that you wish to digitize, there certainly are courses on that. There are conservation courses available. If you'd like me to try and find out more for you, I'm happy to do so. Please send me an email and I will respond. So our next question. Were the 1800s the peak time period for this kind of natural history books? And is there a date range for this kind of book in a library collection? So I think the 1800s was a peak time for a lot of scientific exploration that was happening, and the publications as printing techniques for illustrations became more complex and more sophisticated, that allowed for more range in what was available. And then each person, as they went along, was setting, they were setting precedents, they were setting examples. So Audubon saw what Wilson was doing and thought how he could do it differently or do it more or do it better. The library, actually, the Garrett Library, I could have started as far back as Aldrovandi in the 16th century with his natural history books. With limited time, I could only do so much. We do sort of go up into the 19th century and not so much beyond. And the second part of the question was, is there another form or journal beginning to take precedence since? I think, the internet, there's fantastic information out on the internet that's legit information. There's a bunch that's not, but the Biodiversity Heritage Library website is phenomenal, and I really suggest that you have a look at that. I think the link will be provided for you. It's just great. It has a lot of information. Okay, let's see. So the next question is, it's fascinating that these were serious scientific works, yet also physically imposing objects. How do their size and craftsmanship shape the way we understand them, not just as sources of knowledge, but as status symbols and museum pieces? That's a great question. I think that you'll note, for example, with the Audubon, the double elephant folio was definitely the luxury piece of the deal, right? The smaller volumes, the text volumes would be smaller, not as heavily illustrated, or not as luxuriously illustrated. These things are hard to move around. Even the folio volumes like Gould or the others, it's a physical effort to move them around. And I think if you think about sort of who was moving these around for the Garrett family, it wasn't necessarily the Garretts themselves. They had a librarian, they had servants who would help move these things. So just there is a very physical aspect of accessing these books. And the craftsmanship, yes, absolutely. Bookbinding, the making of the book is a study unto itself. Just different techniques and bindings, and the idea is that the way you create something that doesn't self-destruct. Part of the problem with the Audubon double elephant folios is that they do self-destruct. I said, that they're 60 pounds per volume, but it's amazing how heavy just the covers are. If you come by and visit, I'll let you hoist one up a little bit. You can feel how heavy the cover is. But yeah, so I think definitely status symbols, and definitely things that were places where people with resources or institutions with resources would acquire. Okay, the next question, what kinds of classes and researchers tend to request these kinds of books? It's interesting. I've had some birding groups in before to look at some of these. They become useful for demonstrating illustration processes. We haven't had a whole lot of classes per se that have utilized them in instruction that I've been involved in. I know that when groups come here to Evergreen to look at other things, some of these will be included just because it represents the collecting interest of the family, and it's such a big part of this library here. And also, again, the history of the book, how important they are to the progression of book history. Okay, what's the financial position of those who could afford these books? How much did they cost? Yeah. Let's see. The financial position was you had to have means in order to acquire them. Obviously, while there were sometimes a cheaper alternative that didn't always actually go into production. Some institutions initially passed on becoming a subscriber to some of these things because they felt it was too expensive. I think I may have mentioned, I'm sorry, I'm not remembering. I think I may have mentioned some of the costs involved. Maybe I didn't in my presentation. I don't know off the top of my head what it would be in today's dollars to do something like this. But if you think about a subscription where you'd have a certain number of fascicles sent to you, you'd sign up to have a subscription, and that would fund the production. I think that gives some sense of the sustainability of it, and really to get off the ground, you'd have to have about 100 or 150 subscribers in order to make it a manageable project. And there were also other sources of funding that weren't actually purchasing subscriptions. If you think about some of the Royal Academy patrons who were supplying funds for some of these men to go out and tour around. Does Hopkins have a collection of natural history objects, not books, like Harvard's collection of glass flowers? I do not believe that we don't have a collection that is cohesive like that. There may be things within other collections. I don't know of any. I'm trying to think of the museum's collections, which I'm not as well versed on. Well, obviously, the Evergreen Museum, of course, has the collection of eggs that the Garretts had acquired on their own outings. I don't know how many taxidermied examples there still are. That's more of a question for the museums. I think it's going to be related to things that the Garretts did. I don't know that the archaeological collection would have anything that was also natural history. So I see that those were the main questions. Does anyone, we have a little time left. Are there any other things that people wanted to ask or about other things about the collection other than natural history? It doesn't have to just be about this. Okay then, well, I guess we can wrap up a little bit early. I appreciate you all coming to this, being here and watching this. And I hope you just enjoyed looking at these books. Yeah, and for more information about the Sheridan libraries, I should mention that they are all cataloged as well. So you can find them in the library catalog at Sheridan, the Sheridan Libraries catalog at library.jhe.edu. And if you'd like to look up for more programming, you can go to hopkinsathome.jhe.edu. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and please be in contact if I can be of assistance. Thanks.